thank you so very much. This was really amazing and moving in an age where, especially coming from Silicon Valley, you normally expect when you're being introduced, even at the top university, a shortened or lengthened version of your wiki entry. So this was, it was also, I mean, yes, you were going towards the topic of my lecture, but it was in many ways prophetic. I mean, not that you anticipated the lecture, but I'm very, very grateful. And Christopher, I'm grateful for this invitation again to Cambridge. I love being here. Now this time I arrived on a Sunday morning from the other Cambridge, Massachusetts, and so I had more time to get acclimatized in the Stimmung of Cambridge. And I think I now know more why I like it so much being here. Because, I mean, I'm proudly saying, and here's a former Stanford student of mine, I'm coming from another one of the most excellent universities of the world. I mean, Stanford is a terrific place. I'm very proud to have my name attached to Stanford, or Stanford's name attached to mine. But of course, in this group of top universities, we are very young. We are celebrating only our 125th university, which is very old by Californian standards this year. And what I get staying at Pembroke College, for example, is if you have 700 years of tradition of excellence, you can somehow be more relaxed, stylish, or elegant about it. And I think that's what I'm enjoying here. I mean, I'm very much in the Stanford spirit, you know, I observe rankings, I want us to beat Harvard, of course, that's the only issue. But then to be here and hear people speak with irony about Oxford, that is to learn something. Nobody with irony about Harvard at Stanford, but nor at Harvard about Stanford, at Stanford about Harvard. Anyway, the assignment was last year, and I'm very proud that I got re-invited for the same framework by Christopher, to have topics that are broad, not in a bad way. I mean, yes, I do care about detail, but broad in the sense that they speak to different dimensions. I don't like the word interdisciplinary in the humanities. Now, it's easy to start that. You talk about the humanities. I mean, this is what I talked about last year. But I thought something like an incipient lecture series about the humanities could get more than slightly boring. So this year I will not speak about the humanities at large, but I thought that the topic of prosody, and I mean by prosody what we normally refer to as poetic form, and by addressing the question, what does prosody to a text? I would focus on a problem that is anchored in literary criticism, literary history, literary theory above all, but I do think has vibrations and has a certain repercussion all over the humanities. So I think, and I hope I can show that thinking about prosody, and I hope you think along with me, can be as relevant for the humanities at large as talking just about the humanities in and by themselves. Now, the way I will try to do that, I will try to tackle this problem, is via the concept of rhythm. This is not really a thesis, it's a precondition, it's the conceptual economy. I claim that one can subsume all those phenomena that we associate with poetic form. Verse, rhyme, alliteration, stanza, and so forth and so forth. One can subsume all these phenomena under rhythm. Whether you agree with me will turn out when I provide you within 10 minutes my definition of rhythm. I mean, remains to be seen, but that's the first claim. I mean, I developed the concept of rhythm in order to formulate a thesis about the function of prosody. Of course, I do not ignore that different prosodic phenomena have different specific functions, or should have different specific functions, but the hypothesis is that you first need a broad approach, a certain, call it epistemological basis, before we can really tackle and get involved with more specific questions. What is the specific impact that the form of a sonnet, for example, has on a text compared to the form of the ballad? Now, if you come from literary studies, and I love the title of my chair that was not invented for me, but by the Packard family, from Hewlett and Packard, who are the donors of that chair. I'm professor in literature. I mean, I don't know exactly what the Packard family had in mind when they said Albert Garat professor in literature, but I like this kind of immersion, right? It's like every morning when I park my car as a professor in literature, I feel I dive into literature. Now, if you're a professor in literature, you're fully aware that the question of the function of prosody is the most secret and most embarrassing blind spot of literary criticism and literary theory. So in the typical situation that most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with, you're sitting in an airplane, you start working, somebody's sitting next to you, and you see some letterhead or something that says University of Cambridge or Stanford University, people get very interested, and they ask you, what are you specifically doing? Of course, if you're at Stanford and sitting on United Airlines, for example, that's already embarrassing to say comparative literature. I once got the question, are you saying computer literature? No, no. Comparative literature. And then I would say in 1 out of 2 cases empirically, people start assuming that what you're doing, well, some people think you're teaching languages. So are you a professor of French, you're teaching French, okay, no, not teaching language. But then they associate what you're doing with poetic form. Because poetic form making a difference, I mean being a different form as opposed to prose, is what most people associate with literature. They think you have at hand a full repertoire of poetic form and that you know something about poetic form. The truth, however, is, and I'll try to illustrate that at the beginning of the lecture, that until the present day and throughout its 200 years of history, academic literary criticism has never had an inkling about what is the function of prosody to texts. Hence my very basic question, what does prosody do to texts? I mean, I will talk about that too. In a Max Planck Research Institute in Germany called Empirical Aesthetics, they now transcribe text in poetic form into prose, and then have people react to the prose text and to the poetic text, not very successfully. And yet, this is the right question. I mean, what does prosody do to a text? We don't know, and that's the starting condition of what I want to talk about. So in that sense, I think it is tackling the biggest blind spot in literary studies, but a blind spot that has interesting consequences, interesting entanglements with other fields in the humanities and perhaps even beyond the humanities. One cannot say that literary theory as such has not been obsessed with poetic form. I think if one can say that there are 200 years of literary criticism, you know, Matthew Arnold in England, the Grimm brothers in Germany, and so forth, so I talk about academic institution of literary criticism, that literary theory emerged in the early 20th century as a sub-discipline or as a dimension. And I think the first literary theory that wills to be literary theory is Russian formalism. And as most of you know, Russian formalism was obsessed with poetic form. But Russian formalism never went beyond trying to define the difference between prose and poetic form. Yeah? If you read Shklovsky, if you read Tynjanov, you will find that there is this effect of estrangement, Verfremdungseffekt in German. And it doesn't go much beyond that. So what does this Verfremdungseffekt do? How do you read a text? How are the semantics of a text changed by that? The most famous definition of literature, and I think it should not be a definition of literature, by Roman Jakobson, so famous that the lecturing hall at Indiana University, where he gave that lecture in the early 1960s, now has a plaque. The most frequently text in the literary studies ever was given in this lecturing hall of Indiana University. Gives an answer to the question, what is poetic form? And the famous answer is, it is the projection of the axis of equivalence from the paradigmatic dimension to the syntagmatic dimension. That is a fair enough description of what we can call poetic form, but once again it doesn't give you an answer of what poetic form is doing. I mean, it has been quoted over and again, but Roman Jakobson stops short of saying what it does. He describes linguistically what poetic form is, but we do not know what it does. Even more astonishing for me is the following. If you look at the very high level criticism of one of the most highly canonized and famous bodies of poetry in Western literature, Baudelaire's Fleurs du Mal, and being professor of French, among other things, I start with Baudelaire's Fleurs du Mal. And I mean, all famous critics in Romanistic, of course, have written about Baudelaire. Among them Leo Spitzer, Erich Auerbach, Paul de Man, and my academic advisor, whose name will remain unnamed, unmentioned here, but he was a famous literary critic. If you read what they write about Baudelaire, and you can test it empirically, they could have written absolutely the same thing about Baudelaire if Baudelaire had not written in verse form. Actually, I mean, the choice of verse forms in Baudelaire is not very sophisticated. It's relatively conventional, and yet, given the fact that he also wrote poem en prose, the question would be interesting: how is the function, the impact of poem en prose different from sonnets, for example, that he frequently wrote? No answer to this question. My high school teachers, my gymnasium teachers, pretended to have an answer to the question. That question was immediately, or this answer was immediately transformed into assignment. They would tell us that poetic form corresponds to the semantics, to the content of a text, and then we had to write all these high school essays how it corresponded. I mean, there is a more academic name for that, and that is theory of lyrical overdetermination. I actually believe that this is a close to nonsensical assignment, because I will make this argument in my lecture. I think prosody and semantics are ontologically different. There is no correspondence. I mean, the question of how they correspond to each other is not a question that really works. You could also say, if it ever worked, it would produce more tautology. I mean, not the most glorious outcome. I mean, I think it's a one-way traffic. Recently, and I've already mentioned that, at the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics, a team of two Germanists, one of them very famous, and I really admire his work, Winfried Menninghaus, were running the following experiment. They transcribed ballads, very funny ballads, very popular in Germany, by Wilhelm Busch, a late 19th century author from Frankfurt, Max und Moritz, you may know, not very serious, into prose, and then tested how people would react differently to the prose version, to the ballad version. And lo and behold, they found out that people find the ballad version more funny. I mean, that the fun of Wilhelm Busch is somehow fading away if you write it in prose. I mean, that is not terribly surprising, you know. We do that very often in the humanities, that we state the obvious, investing 2 million euro. That was very expensive, and in Germany, actually, if you spend much money, that gives you an aura that the research is very valuable. I mean, if you acquire Drittmittel and invest them, and then say in a footnote, we thank the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft for 2 million euro, that gives a certain, but this is the only authority that this article has, and I've told my friend Winfried Menninghaus, so that does not really help. The best answer that I've found so far, and it is far from being a complete answer, to the question, what does prosody do to a text, is actually by my, and I'm not embarrassed to use this word, beloved and much admired late colleague Richard Rorty, who, when he came to Stanford for what ended up being the last 10 years of his academic career, insisted to become a professor in comparative literature and not of philosophy. Of course, this was fantastic for comparative literature. At Stanford, that Richard Rorty wanted to be in the comparative literature department. Now, the last text that Richard Rorty wrote very few weeks before his death, and that's part of the story, you should download. It's a beautifully written short text. The New York Times obituary of Richard Rorty said he may not be one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, but he certainly was one of the greatest philosophical authors of the 20th century, and I fully agree with the second part of the sentence. I will not say whether I agree or not with the first part of the sentence, but I mean, he writes very beautifully, and the title of the text is The Fire of Life. Now let me briefly talk to you about the fire of life. So Richard Rorty, actually in the same month as his very close friend Jacques Derrida, got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. So to my knowledge, nobody to the day has survived a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer for more than 2 years, including Steve Jobs. Was diagnosed pancreatic cancer, and 3 days after that gave a commencement day speech at Stanford and said he would invest all his money to see whether there was a cure, not only for himself, but he died 18 months after that. So Richard Rorty, being diagnosed, all of a sudden receives a strange visit, and this was a remote relative from the American South, and he was a minister. Now, Richard Rorty was old-fashioned enough to be a confessing atheist. He was not an agnostic. He was one of those old-fashioned, no, God does really not exist. And the minister, of course, wanted to turn around. you know, with this diagnostic of pancreatic cancer. And so to get a turnaround, he asked Richard Rorty, dear Dick, dear Richard, are there any texts you regret to not have read, and you may not have enough time left to read those texts? And I mean, Richard Rorty, who was a fantastic lecturer, but rather shy as a person, said, no, I cannot remember any text. Is there anything, you know, I can know about death, can get out of Heidegger, Epicurus? I mean, that's all known, that's not terribly relevant. And his son was part of the conversation, and now I quote, so his son was seemingly interested in this question, so is there nothing, no text you would read? And the son says, quote, hasn't anything you have read ever been of any use? My son asked. Yes, I found myself blurting out poetry. And the son asked, which poems? He asked, I quoted 2 old chestnuts that I had recently dredged up, very Rorty language, that I had recently dredged up from memory and been oddly cheered by the most quoted lines of Swinburne's Garden of Proserpine and Landor's on his 75th birthday. So that's the first thing. He had dredged up from memory, and as you will see later, had recited those poems. So it was not about the content of the poem, it was about the poems. And then he tries to describe what prosody does to a text, and I think his description is at least as good as any description in literary theory that I've found, but doesn't get much further. So this is his more kind of professor of comparative literature description. I found comfort in those slow, referring to the 2 poems, in those slow meanders and those stuttering embers. I suspect that no comparable effect could have been produced by prose. Not just imagery, but also rhyme and rhythm were needed to do the job. In lines such as these, all 3, so rhyme, rhythm, and imagery, all 3 conspire to produce a degree of compression, that's the word, and thus of impact that only verse can achieve. Compared to the sharp charges contrived by versifiers, even the best prose is scattershot. So that's Rorty's first answer, and this is about compression, and I think it's a good description, but I don't think it gets us any further. Yes, you get a more compressed version of something, but why is that good, or how does that help? So why does it fascinate you? And then Rorty says, that's a leitmotif that he never managed to write a poem himself because his father was a poet and he had a very traumatic relationship with his father. And then comes the last paragraph, and this is really what I found, not technically, not in the sense of our discussion of this afternoon, the most helpful, but inspiring. I think this is an interesting statement. This is where I wanted to go. He says, however that may be, so I never wrote poems, I now wish that I had spent somewhat more time of my life with verse. That I had spent somewhat more time of my life with verse. This is not because I fear having missed out on truths that are incapable of statement in prose. There are no such truths. There's nothing about death that Swinburne and Landor knew, but Epicurus and Heidegger failed to grasp. Rather, it is because I would have lived more fully if I had been able to rattle off more old chestnuts, just as I would have if I had made more close friends. So once again, rather it is because I would have lived more fully had I been able to rattle off more old chestnuts. So this question, what can it mean if Rorty says, I would have lived more fully, not hermeneutically reading more poetry, but memorizing more poetry, being able to recite more poetry? That is going to be the question. You see, that is not an answer yet, but I think, and that was very helpful for me, that was the best formulated question ever. That gets you into a larger, you could say philosophically, existentialist context. I start my real argument with an apology. Everything I have to say, and this is doubly embarrassing about how old I am and how little inventive I am, goes back to an essay I published in 1989 under the title Rhythmus und Sinn, Rhythm and Meaning. It has came out in a couple of other languages. I have ever since, I think, complexified this argument. I think it holds water now philosophically better than at the beginning, but it is basically a complex version of this early argument, and I'm saying this because I have never really gotten to find a good answer to the more specific question. Yeah? I mean, this old intuition and what I develop, I think in a more complex way today, is a question about what does rhythm do to texts. And I have not gotten into the specification of what does verse, what does stanza, and so forth do to text, nor let alone to the question of what does a sonnet do to a text, what does Alexandrin do to a text, and so forth and so forth. I am convinced, however, and I will come back to that at the end of my lecture, that maybe there is no general, no theoretical answer to this question. You may be empirically able to say it in the terms of individual poems, but there's no general answer. So the menu, the outline, the structure of my argument goes like this. I will start with the definition of rhythm, and that is the moment for you to check whether you believe that this definition of rhythm subsumes all phenomena of prosody. That is my claim. In the second part, I will concentrate on two functions that we conventionally associate with rhythm, and that's the memnotechnic function of rhythm, but we also associate with poetic form. I mean, it helps you to have something stored in your memory in poetic form to remember it, and body coordination. Body coordination is something that happens with rhythm, and to a certain degree, it happens with prosodic form in political rallies, for example. If you go to South America, El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. I mean, that sentence that the united people will never be defeated is clearly untrue. But if you pronounce it in rhythmic form, everybody believes it and gets going on it. So, I mean, these are the two functions I want to explain. And in the third part, I come to what I consider the most complex intuition about a function of rhythm and prosody, and that is conjuring up. In the literal sense of the word, almost in the anthropological sense of the word, that rhythm and texts with rhythm produce the impression that a phenomenon, may that be material, may that be a person, may that be an atmosphere, becomes palpable for you, stands in front of you. Presence, I mean associate presence with tangibility. In the end, you cannot touch this person that Shakespeare talks about, but there is this conjuring up function, and I think this conjuring up function will get me to a tentative answer of the promise of Richard Rorty, an explanation why did Rorty think he would have had a fuller life having more old chestnuts, more poems in his memory. And in the final part, I will try to tackle this question of specification. I mean, can be theorized about different prosodic forms having different functions. But as I was already announcing, this will lead to a negative answer. I think we cannot, but to sweeten the pill, I will end up by reading you one entire short poem by Friedrich Hölderlin and two fragments of poems by Friedrich Hölderlin, so that we stay in the mood. And as Friedrich Hölderlin is definitely the poet of German language who had the most prosodic complexity, the highest prosodic complexity, I think I have a right as a German native speaker to end on that. And you all have the handout. Yeah? This is really important because I want you to be able to get the semantics in English while you're listening to the recitation. It's a little bit difficult, some of you know that for me. I mean, if you lecture from notes, to say how long this is going to be. If the hermeneutics of the phases stay like they are now, it's going to be another 40 minutes. If you look at me like to become a little bit more friendly, if you're interested, you may be even passionate. I make this joke always, but it's always true. I will get loquacious, it's longer. If you look at me with stone faces, like it happens sometimes in Germany, my wife said that German listeners in academic events are pumpy. Then I get embarrassed and skip things, it gets shorter. Whatever it will be, the responsibility is with you. But I think the estimate is plus minus 40 minutes. No rhythm. What I want to propose as a definition of rhythm is inspired by several attempts to describe and define rhythm, especially by the French linguist Benveniste, but it is basically eclectic, like most of my lectures. So I'm making theory references reference to philosophy at different spots, and whether there is a common epistemological denominator would be another question, but it is so difficult, it was so difficult for me to get a basis for this problem. What does rhythm do to a text? That I paid the price of eclecticism. So here is my proposal for a definition. An analytic philosopher would probably not call that a definition, but whatever. I think whenever we speak of rhythm in everyday language, we refer to a practical, and I underline practical, solution of the problem whether a time object in the sense proper, and that is a quote from Husserl, Zeitobjekt im eigentlichen Sinn, can have a form. Let me say that again, so it's very abstract, I will explain it. So whenever we use the word rhythm, even unknowingly, we refer to a practical solution of the problem, how a time object in the sense proper can have a form. Okay. What's the problem, really? I mean, what's the problem that's being resolved? How does Husserl define a time object in the sense proper? This is based on Husserl's, I think, very, very important proposal for a definition of time. He says, time is the structure or the form of human consciousness. And what he refers to is his intuition that every present moment in our consciousness, inevitably, structurally, is surrounded by protension, an anticipation of the next moment, not an anticipation of next year. You can only understand it because you can anticipate fractions of seconds what's going to be the next phoneme that I'm going to produce. And retention, and that is again a fraction of a second, but there's always the three-dimensionality. And when Husserl talks about Zeitobjekt im eigentlichen Sinn, he refers to phenomena that can only exist, that can only be recognized by us in their unfolding in time. Like language, that is of course the most obvious example as I'm speaking, like music, like any type of movement. That's time object in the sense proper. Zeitobjekt im eigentlichen Sinn. Now, the other key concept here is form. In order to explain that it is a problem how a time object in the proper sense can have a form, I have to give you a definition of form. Now, as some of you know, there is an unbelievable wealth from the history of Western philosophy of definitions of form. Eclectic as I will be in this lecture, I refer the first time and then I will refer a second time to Niklas Luhmann, who was officially a sociologist, but I think he was one of the more inspired philosophers actually in the German intellectual context in the last half century. Niklas Luhmann defines form as the paradoxical simultaneity of self-reference and outside reference. The paradoxical simultaneity of self-reference and outside reference. Imagine a circle. I mean, what he refers to is the circle always refers to itself, it's inside. That's what we refer to as the form of the circle. But it also simultaneously refers to everything outside. I mean, the Umwelt, the environment, so to speak. So I think it is obvious then that we only talk about a form if that form has a stability. Yeah, if that circle, for example, starts to morph, as we say in Silicon Valley, into a quadrangle, and then into a round, and that back into a larger circle, and so forth, and ondulates, would not call it a form anymore, would call it something different. So this is the origin of the question, how can a time object in the sense proper, so something that by constitution has to change all the time, have a form, if form is associated with stability? Is the question clear? And so normally we would not attribute the predicate of form to something that constitutively has to change, cannot exist without changes. The answer to the question was actually inspired, I would almost say, by Lufthansa. It was really inspired, I don't like Lufthansa very much, but it was inspired by Lufthansa, by the logo a long time ago of the Expo 2000 in Hanover. It was one of those typical situations when you allowed to get into the airplane and people get their luggages in the overhead bell, and it takes time and time. And there was a screen, all Lufthansa airplanes, with a logo of the Expo 2000. And that's Expo 2000 Hanover. And then it was a circle and the logo, and then it transformed into a quadrangle and so forth and so on. It's a weird logo. And as people took so much time to get into their seats, so I was standing there for more than 30 seconds, and I realized that from a certain moment on it would go through the same alterations. So it was back at square one, and it was the image I originally saw, and then it became a quadrangle, and it became a circle, and so forth and so forth. And I say now, yes, it is a logo. And the logo, the form is precisely that it goes back through the alterations. I mean, that's what we call a rhythm. Yeah? It has a rhythm, the logo has a rhythm. And this is why the logo has a form in spite of being a time object in the sense proper. Is that clear? So that is the basic and first intuition. So rhythm allows a time object in the sense proper to have a form that you can refer to. You can say everything that has a different form is outside, is the Umwelt, is the environment of that form. So we don't have the time, as if this was a seminar, that I ask you whether you can subsume all phenomena of poetic form under this definition, but that is my claim. And this takes me to the second part of the argument. What functions do we then associate with rhythm in general? You could definitely associate this running everyday time with chronos, and you could more problematically associate time that has a form with kairos. I know that's problematic, but I mean, one colleague at Stanford, Bernardinger, I could get away with that. I mean, maybe Simon, you tell me whether I can really get away with it, but I could replace it. But you get my point. I associate kairos with time that has a form, that is rhythm. So we can then say that kairos cuts a form into chronos. So when I read this poem to you, or if I was a good dancer, for example, the moment that this dancer gets into a rhythm that cuts time, you cannot say about everyday time what beginning it has and what ending is. I can speculate about this theologically, but everyday time chronos by definition doesn't have a beginning of an ending. Whereas everything that has a rhythm has a beginning and an ending. You can say it goes back to square one. My example about the logo of the Expo 2000 came back to the starting point, like, you know, if you have several stanzas in a poem, you get back to a starting point. At some point it will finish. From the moment on that you realize that this is poetic language, you know, the moment on you realize that it is not noise but music, you know that it will have an ending. That can take a long time, but you know it has now begun and will have an ending. Is that distinction clear? Now, I think that the effect of kairos, the effect of form of time, is that everything that is within that form becomes tendentially simultaneous, and difficult to describe, but maybe you follow my intuition that in general, the effect of this form of time cut into the running time of the everyday slows down the pace of the running time. So within the poem, for example, everything becomes potentially simultaneous. Everything that you have ever experienced can become present, and I think this is the explanation, or the beginning of an explanation of the memnotechnical function of rhythm and the memnotechnical function of poetic form. As you slow down time, and as everything becomes simultaneous within that time frame, you can remember things that you have learned a long time ago if you store them in rhythmic form. I mean, proof being, most of you have done that. I mean, I can still remember rules of Latin grammar that I learned when I was 10 years old in 1958, if I stored them in poetic form. I mean, they're not very functional for me, but I can give you all the exceptions of the third declension in Latin, for example, all feminines in third declension, or, I mean, and that I remember with music, a, e, de, cum, sine, pro, and pre. It is not very useful for me to know what the prepositions with ablative are, but I will never forget them until the day I die, unless I die of Alzheimer. But even with Alzheimer, I think they have a longer survival chance. So, metaphorically speaking, I think this creating a simultaneity that slows down the running of time, through that, rhythm becomes, metaphorically speaking, a window through which things from the past that we would normally not remember can become present again. So that is one function of prosody, not the most sensational one, but I would like to illustrate that. You can turn your page with the second point here. In general, I definitely am not one of those literary critics, and I think this was implied in the introduction, who thinks that poets wrote poetry in order to illustrate theorems of literary theory. But now, lots of people think that, Poleman, for example, but I'm now just reading you what I think is one of the, certainly one of the most highly canonized poems in German of the 20th century, Asters, by Gottfried Benn. And this is a poem, I think, that performs what it is semantically describing. That's not a normal case, but I'm not saying all poems do that. But this is an interesting case, because this is a poem, Asters, that's the association about what we call in English in general, especially American English, Indian summer. And it is a poem about the desire that Indian summer may not go. Summer should not turn into fall. And at the beginning of the poem, there's talking about a spell. There's a spell that makes time stand still for a short moment. And in the last two verses, that spell is over, and the summer goes. And I have actually intentionally used that function at least well with my Californian students, now mainly German poems, because I assume that most of you do not know German. And that means you can actually better focus on the prosody. This is why I gave you the summary, and now try to get into the rhythm, and maybe, I don't know how one precisely do that, you oscillate a little bit with the translation. Astern. Astern, schwälende Tage, alte Beschwörung, Bann, die Götter halten die Waage eine zögernde Stunde an. Noch einmal die goldenen Herden, der Himmel, das Licht, der Flor, was brütet das alte Werden unter den sterbenden Flügeln vor? Noch einmal das Ersehnte, den Rausch, der Rosen Du, der Sommer stand und lehnte und sah den Schwalben zu. Noch einmal ein Vermuten, wo längst Gewissheit wacht. Die Schwalben streifen die Fluten und trinken Fahrt und Nacht. In this prosody, what I find particularly impressive are the last two verses, when summer goes. There is this holding on the summer, it does not go, and then the last two lines, the swallows are skimming the waters and drinking flight in dark, and it lets go. And I think this is the best exemplification that I know about this prosodic function of holding on time. Now, there's another function that we associate with rhythm, and via rhythm with poetry. I gave you already an example with El Pueblo Unido, Jamás será vencido, and that is body coordination. You find a correct reference in Being and Time to that. In Heidegger, God knows for what reason, insists that soldiers are marching better, more precisely, somewhere halfway through Being and Time, if they are singing a song. I don't know why he cared about that, because to our biographical knowledge, he was never marching. He was in the meteorological service in World War I, but he insists on that. But we also all know that a couple, for example, can become physically one somehow. It's the feeling of one body by dancing a rhythm together, even by listening to music together. Now, how can one explain this second function of body coordination? This is so empirically obvious that rhythm can do that, that we don't ask that question. But how can we explain that? I will go back to another distinction again by Niklas Luhmann, and then I'm not referring to him again. And this is a distinction between what he calls first-order coupling and second-order coupling. First-order coupling in between systems, and systems can be social systems, for him systems can be machines, but systems can also be two bodies. Now, first-order coupling, according to Luhmann, is that kind of coupling that he calls non-productive. State 1 in system A produces state 2 in system B, state 2 in system B triggers state 3 in system A, state 3 in system A triggers state 4 at system B, and so forth, and at a certain point, longer or shorter, they come back to the first state, to state 1, and it goes again. I mean, like this logo example. Now, basically, Luhmann is explicitly saying that rhythms are the medium of first-order couplings. So, okay, I hope I've given you as good an account as I can do about why we associate memnotechnical functions and this body coordination functions with rhythm and with prosody, and I will now try to tackle the more complex question, the most complex question, that is the question of this function of conjuring up. I mean, people have very often been saying that and using that word. Poetry conjures up certain memories, poetry conjures up certain situations, conjures up bodies, body of the beloved. Maybe this is the reason why love declarations are so often formulated poetically. Let me do a first step, and I'm going back to Stimmung. I think independently of prosody, every language recited can produce a Stimmung. Because I think what triggers atmospheres, moods, in the sense of being in the mood, is always the lightest possible touch of your physical environment on your body. This is, I think, why we associate moods, atmospheres, Stimmung, and I like the word Stimmung because the root is German Stimme. Yeah, so it's something like voiceness, you cannot translate it, but it's the impact. I mean, at this moment, the tone of my voice, I mean, the lecture may bore you, but the tone of my voice produces a certain atmosphere by really touching the lightest touch of your physical environment on your body. So any text recited produces in that sense a Stimmung. The most beautiful description of that phenomenon I know is from Toni Morrison from her novel Jazz, and she describes mood by saying it is like being touched from inside. The paradox intended, nobody can touch you from inside, but something that touches your body produces a certain normally expectable change, state of mind. I know, for example, that a certain type of light in the morning in California, a certain temperature, late afternoon in the summer combined with night, or a German November day produces a specific mood. I'm not saying I can make a general social convention, but it happens. And with reciting of poetry, there is no poetry that does not produce, in this sense, a Stimmung. That is a first step. But a second step would be that at the same time, the voice has an impact on our imagination. The voice has an impact on our imagination, and to explain what impact it has on our imagination, together with this thesis of Luhmann of rhythm lowering the tension of attention, I would go back to George Herbert Mead, to a very beautiful description of imagination, of how imagination functions, that is from the early 1930s. So the example with which George Herbert Mead tries to illustrate what imagination is quote-unquote an early Homo sapiens. I think he says an early Homo sapiens because he wants to associate this, should we call him or her subject, with low tension of attention. And he describes, I mean, it's a kind of narrative, but I think it is interesting, that this early Homo sapiens perceives a noise, it's the question of perception. That noise triggers an imagery in his consciousness, an intentional object, and tendentially that can be, for example, the image of a stronger animal, or an animal that is very dangerous, or a weaker animal, an animal that can basically be killed and eaten. And the point about imagination, and I think George Herbert Mead has an important point, is that if it is just imagination that we would associate with low tension of attention into which prosody gets us, if it is just imagination, it will immediately trigger an innervation. It will immediately have an impact on your body and will lead, this is the early Homo sapiens, to movement of attack or movement of escape. Now it doesn't have to be a movement of tackling or movement of escaping, But you all know what George Herbert Mead describes by your daydreams. Yeah? Many of our daydreams, and even as a prudish Californian would say, erotic daydreams, of course have an immediate impact on our bodies. We all know that. We can all observe that. Now, this would only happen, and this is a condition, if, for example, not exclusively, under the impression of prosody, you are on a relatively low level of tension of attention. If you are more alert, on a higher level of attention, then you will filter your imagination with the concept. And once you have filtered that image with the concept, the immediate impact, the immediate triggering of innovation is interrupted. Then you can decide whether you want to escape, or whether you want to kill, or whether you want to be flirtatious, etc., etc. But as long as you are on this low level of attention, I think you cannot decide, and I think this is precisely the conjuring up function. This is the conjuring up function because as the images produced in your mind under the impact of prosody, by the semantics of the text, but under the impact of prosody, will trigger immediate body reactions. Your body behaves as if the object that you are imagining was physically in front of you. Yeah? We react according to our images as if what we imagine was physically in front of us under the impact of prosody. And this is what we call the conjuring up effect. We all know that sonnet 18 will not make physically present this young man. But for those who will imagine this young man, or for those who imagine a young man or a young body with this poem, this can become as if it were physically present. And I think this is the conjuring up effect. Was this somehow clear? So it is the imagination that triggers body effects. You have the body effects as if the object was there, but of course ontologically, in reality, the object is not there. I want to underline that these functions that I have been describing, especially the body coordination functions and the function of conjuring up, are functions that are objective. They may happen to you even if you don't want to read this poem. Yeah? If you pass by this rally and people say Pueblo Unido, etc., etc., you're being dragged into this coordination. You may imagine something. This is why, for example, prosodic forms have such an important function, unfortunately, fortunately, in advertising. Yeah? I mean, it will have this objective impact on it. It's sometimes, under certain conditions, very difficult to escape. But as we are now through part 3 and there's only one part left, let me try to give a first tentative answer to Richard Rorty's motif. Why did he say that being able to rattle up more old chestnuts, or why to be able to memorize more old poems would have made his life more fulfilled, a more complex life? I think there's a number of functions that we can associate with prosody. Prosody coordinates bodies with other bodies. Not only when I'm reciting your bodies with my body, but also in a certain way it makes sonnet 18 Shakespeare present, and you can be in one rhythm with somebody who died many centuries ago. This is, for example, I don't know if I'm capable of citing Sappho of Lesbos in prosodic form. This is almost 3 millennia, and this is an uncanny feeling. So you are coordinated with the person that produced this prosody. So this is one function. It also makes present, mnemotechnical function, but present in a different way, experience, oftentimes lived experience from a long time ago. Like, I mean, not only the knowledge of the 7 prepositions with ablative, but also it brings back that moment. And my Latin teacher, Dr. Kurt Fina, whom I didn't like very much, but when I'm saying aed cum sine pon pre, this is present. Prosodic form, in the third place, produces specific psychic states, tonality, Stimmung. I mean, you cannot not be in a certain mood when you are exposed to prosody, whether you want it or not. I mean, for example, this is why I'm abusing the situation and read these poems to you, and you cannot help, I mean, maybe it's possible, but you have to make a real effort to not be, in the physical sense, touched by them. And finally, prosody seems to have the capacity to conjure up, in the way I tried to explain, to conjure up those things that they evoke, their semantics evoke in our imagination. It is as if these things were physically present. So I think what prosody does, and I will come back to that with more synthetic description, but I wanted to give you the full complexity, the 4 dimensions, which I've been trying to explore. It indeed gives you a fuller life. Yeah? I mean, the span of what you can remember is being extended. The bodies with which you can be coordinated gets expanded. I mean, we cannot all dance together individually. I mean, I'm very bad at doing that. Would take us a long time. But if I recite this poem and now think of the party rally, or think, you know, of crowds in stadiums, I absolutely admire British crowds. Anfield Road, they beat my favorite team, Borussia Dortmund, this year. But it was an amazing moment, this coordination. When they sing, "You Never Walk Alone," this is an absolutely amazing moment. So you can be coordinated with bodies, but extended, a fuller life, a richer life. You can also be coordinated with somebody way back in the past. And I will come back to this function specifically, via body coordination and via imagination, it somehow gives your body back to space. It gives your body back to the spatial condition. It inscribes you somewhere in your life. And once again, it's very difficult to define the degree. It happens involuntarily. There's an objectivity to that. If you're exposed to prosody, if you're exposed to rhythm, this will happen to you, whatever that exactly means, relatively independently of your own decision, of your own will. It's very difficult to escape this function. Now, this makes me go to my 4th question, and the final question, as I have already announced, the question that is difficult to answer. Is it possible to develop something on this basis, something like a theory of specific functions, of specific prosodic elements? You know? What does a sonnet specifically do to us, and how would that be different from, you know, an ancient Greek meter, or how would that be different from a ballad, etc., etc.? I think one reason, and that's the easier reason, why, or the less serious reason, why we cannot develop a general theory is that the difference that certain prosodic forms make in different languages are different. They depend on the basic structure of a language. So a sonnet, for example, or a certain type of verse functions differently in Germanic languages with initial stress, I mean, to give you a very easy example, from what they function in Romance languages with stress at the end of the word, etc., etc. So you couldn't talk about the sonnet in general. You could only talk about a sonnet, how it functions in English, how it functions in German, etc., etc. I mean, with sufficient time differentiation and Drittmittel, one could probably solve this question. The more serious question is really that of historical difference. I think the difference that prosodic forms are making, different prosodic forms, do not only refer to the background of different natural languages, they also refer to the background of historical soundscapes. I've always been fascinated that this very complex, but also to a certain degree very heavy meter of the Alexandrin was absolutely popular in Paris throughout the 17th century. I mean, the one thing you went to in Paris in the 17th century, if you could only afford it and it was not very expensive, was theater. There was indeed, I mean, difficult for us to imagine if you read it, but Corneille was just a popular thing. And the aristocrats sitting on the stage, like in the Shakespeare case, but you had people go there, and we do know from contemporary description that they were reciting Corneille on the street. Now, that is very difficult to imagine, and that, I think, would have to be related to a specific soundscape in Paris in the 17th century that we will never be able to reconstruct. I think this is really a limit for the historical research about the functions of prosody. And yet, one can of course say that within one group of native speakers, within a historical moment, you can make differences. And this is what I tried to do in a seminar that I taught at Stanford, an undergraduate seminar, a year ago on Hölderlin. And I started, first I made sure, and I was lucky enough that none of the 14 students, undergraduate students, knew German, let alone was a native speaker. I said, okay, I'll start every session by reading you a Hölderlin poem, and you just describe this prosody. Not by identifying what meter it would be, which is very, very complex in Hölderlin. Anyway, just describe what this prosody makes you feel. And it was, and this is how far my empirical experiments go, it was actually quite coherent. So you could say that the difference that people are making, that people are feeling by being exposed to different prosodic forms are relatively convergent. Yeah? Don't go any further, but okay, I was lucky enough, nobody from the German department, no German major took the course. They were all interested in poetry, they were very good expressing, so there is a convergence. Now nobody in the history of German literature actually was more obsessed with this problem, with the different functions of different types of prosody than Friedrich Hölderlin himself. Not only because of his own poetic production, but because he considered to be his main contribution translations from ancient Greek, mainly tragedies, and he was obsessed with the question similar to that question that became then more famous through Benjamin. Is there an equivalent for certain poetic forms, for certain forms of verse from ancient Greek in the German language? He never found a solution, but there is a very interesting fragment by Hölderlin, and that is, like everything he wrote systematically, remained a fragment about the alternations of tones. Das Fragment über den Wechsel der Töne in der Lyrik. Now, unfortunately for us, Hölderlin does not make exactly the connection that would be useful for me at the end of this lecture, a differentiation between certain poetic forms that you can identify on the one hand and something like Stimmungen on the other hand. Hölderlin talks about shine, difficult to translate. I would translate in this case as something like Oberfläche, a surface impression, maybe what my students were writing down when they got exposed to Hölderlin verses, and on the other side, Bedeutung. And I think Bedeutung he does not really mean in the sense of signified, in the sense of a meaning, but rather in the sense of Stimmung, and he distinguishes between three different tones and associates certain psychic states with them. The first tone he characterizes by tragic. Difficult to know why he calls it tragic, but he says the surface impression, der Schein, is that of a division, eine Teilung. Yeah, Teilung, maybe he means a tension. And then he says, surprisingly, the psychic state is intellectual vision. I think he means something like conceptual, almost philosophical clarity. So if there is a division, a tension on the surface of the poem, I will give you then an example, it produces psychic clarity. Second distinction, or second tonality, he calls epic. He says the surface is natural, simple, for example, descriptions of landscapes, and the psychic state, interestingly, is endeavor, Absicht. So you want to do something, if you hear that. It's not what we would normally associate. It's quite interesting. The third tonality that he describes, the surface is idea-driven, and then when he describes it, you would say it is something that we would associate with self-reflexivity. You think about yourself, you try to clarify how you react to certain things. So idea-driven, and surprisingly, the psychic state he associates with it is a strong, naive feeling. From his descriptions, I believe he associates that, surprisingly again, reflexivity with the conjuring up function. Now, I will not go any further. It is, I think, it's a reading recommendation. It is, I think, worthwhile reading it, worthwhile, like we were discussing in Crash, to be inspired by the text by Hölderlin. You cannot really systematically draw it out, complete it, but it is, I think, very inspirational. But in concluding, and after that there will be only 3 more sentences, I would like to read one entire Hölderlin poem to you and 2 fragments, and you can just see after this lecture in which mood they get you. I mean, whether the Hölderlin description is good. I'm not necessarily doing that to say Hölderlin is right, but I think this is an interesting blueprint for self-observation. The first poem is very short by Hölderlin standards, arguably his most canonized poem, Hälfte des Lebens. And although we have no autobiographical evidence, I think it is very clear that it corresponds to his description of tragic, because on the surface there is a clear division. You will see that the tonality of the first stanza and the second stanza, both semantically and prosodically, and I'm not saying that they correspond, is really a contrast. Yeah? This is Hälfte des Lebens. And Hölderlin associates with that conceptual clarity. Also, I think he means something like philosophical clarity, in which I find is surprising. For me, I will say it absolutely functions with Hälfte des Lebens. So you have the poem at hand. In that case, the title is part of the poem, so I will read the title. In the 2 other ones, they're fragments, and one should not read the title. Hälfte des Lebens. Mit gelben Birnen hänget und voll mit wilden Rosen das Land in den See. Ihr holden Schwäne und trunken von Küssen tunkt ihr das Haupt ins heilig nüchterne Wasser. Weh mir, wo nehm ich, wenn es Winter ist, die Blumen und wo den Sonnenschein und Schatten der Erde? Die Mauern stehen, sprachlos und kalt, im Winde klirren die Fahnen. That produces the same effect Shakespeare's sonnet producing here. Quite amazing. The next one, a very famous fragment, very late Hölderlin. I mean, very late, not in his physical life, but very late in his physical life, before whatever disease hit him at age 37. And this is exactly half of his life, about 74 years old. Wie wenn am Feiertage. Now, wie wenn am Feiertage, as you will see, I will read you the first 2 stanzas, is above all a description. It's a description of a peasant who, after a thunderstorm, goes out to check whether anything bad has happened to his field. Then it goes into reflection, but I just want to read the first 2 stanzas. I mean, this is what Hölderlin presupposes in alternation of tones, that normally there's an alternation of tones within one long poem. I'll read you just the first 2 stanzas because this is a description of a landscape, and Hölderlin associates with that type of surface endeavor, Absicht. Wie wenn am Feiertage das Feld zu sehen ein Landmann geht, des Morgens, wenn aus heißer Nacht die kühlenden Blitze fielen die ganze Zeit, und fern noch tönet der Donner, in sein Gestade wieder tritt der Strom, und frisch der Boden grünt und von des Himmels erfreuendem Regen der Weinstock trauft und glänzend in stiller Sonne stehen die Bäume des Haines. So stehen sie unter günstiger Witterung, sie, die kein Meister allein, die wunderbar allgegenwärtig erzieht in leichtem Umfangen die mächtige, die göttlich schöne Natur. Drum wenn zu schlafen sie scheinen zu Zeiten des Jahres am Himmel, oder unter den Pflanzen oder den Völkern, so trauert der Dichter Angesicht auch. Sie scheinen allein zu sein, doch ahnen sie immer, denn ahnend ruhet sie selbst auch. The third and final poem of which I want to read a part for you is one of the most proverbially famous ones, Heidelberg. It is the description of a place that many of you know, as this is not a class, I'm not saying how many of you have been there, but it is the old bridge across the river Neckar at Heidelberg, which was then a new bridge. I mean, it had just been built, so for Hölderlin it was like very modern architecture. I think this corresponds in his description to the self-reflexive type. I mean, he describes how he, coming to Heidelberg, experiences this city and this place. I do think it comes the closest to this conjuring up function. Yeah? I mean, yes, I've been at this place endless times, but if you have been on this place, I do think it has this capacity of making present, but once again, this is not about proving Hölderlin right. I mean, it is concluding this lecture by going through the problem with you. And I will read you the first 4 stanzas. Heidelberg. Lange lieb ich dich schon, möchte dich mir zur Lust Mutter nennen und dir schenken ein kunstlos Lied, du der Vaterlandstätte ländlich Schönste, so viel ich sah. Wie der Vogel des Walds über die Gipfel fliegt, schwingt sich über den Strom, wo er vorbei dir glänzt, leicht und kräftig die Brücke, die von Wagen und Menschen tönt. Wie von Göttern gesandt, fesselt ein Zauber einst auf die Brücke mich an, da ich vorüberging, und herein in die Berge mir die reizende Ferne schien, und der Jüngling, der Strom fort in die Ebene zog, traurig froh wie das Herz, wenn es, sich selbst zu schön, liebend unterzugehen, in die Fluten der Zeit sich wirft. So much about Hölderlin. Let me finish by trying to find something like a formula that may react to the impression of these Hölderlin poems, and it's going to be another 30 seconds or so. Thanks to prosody, I think, text can connect us to the material and physical world that surrounds us, at least for moments. They can connect us to the physical world that surrounds us in a more complex way, perhaps, than anything else. Thanks to prosody, text can enable us for moments to be what we physically are. Texts in prosodic form, as Richard Rorty wrote and anticipated, can give us a fuller life because to a certain degree they give us back to space. They give us back to space. That would be my main answer, my main elaboration on the Rorty question. Why do they give us a fuller life? Now, within specific languages, specific poetic forms can assign us to specific places in this material and physical world. So if we would go further with this Hölderlin analysis based on the hypothesis that prosody gives us back to space, at least for moments, you would ask specifically what space would it be that Heidelberg or that Vivian Feiertage or that Hälfte des Lebens assigns you. So it would be a question of which cosmological place we are being assigned by a poem. This, I think, is the reason why Friedrich Hölderlin, in his reflections about the alternation of tones, tried to be so obsessively precise, that is more a reading experience, so close to mathematical. Many thanks for your attention.